Between 1962 and 1973, the United States military conducted secret tests exposing thousands of its own sailors to chemical and biological weapons. Under a program called Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, approximately 5,900 naval personnel participated in experiments involving nerve agents, biological pathogens, and chemical simulants. According to declassified Department of Defense documents, 134 tests were planned. At least 46 were actually conducted, though the exact number remains unclear due to incomplete records. In many cases, according to veteran testimony and congressional findings, sailors were not informed they were part of chemical and biological warfare experiments. Some were told the substances were harmless. Others weren't told anything at all. Decades later, when veterans developed cancers, respiratory diseases, and neurological conditions, many couldn't prove their illnesses were service-connected. Why? Because their exposure was never documented in their medical records. The Department of Veterans Affairs denied thousands of disability claims. The reason? No documentation meant no proof of exposure. It took investigative journalism and congressional pressure to force a partial declassification in the early 2000s. Even now, significant details remain classified. This is the documented history of Project SHAD, a program that used U.S. military personnel as test subjects in chemical and biological warfare experiments. To understand Project SHAD, you need to understand the Cold War environment of the early 1960s. Both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed chemical and biological weapons. Both sides were developing nerve agents, substances that could kill within minutes of skin contact. Both were weaponizing diseases like anthrax, plague, and tularemia. The strategic question wasn't whether these weapons existed. It was whether defenses against them were possible. In 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara authorized a comprehensive research program to develop defensive countermeasures against chemical and biological weapons. The program was designated Project 112, named after its Defense Department budget line. Project 112 encompassed multiple research efforts. Some tests were conducted on land at military installations. Others took place in laboratories. The largest component involved testing aboard naval vessels. This became known as Project SHAD, or Shipboard Hazard and Defense. According to Department of Defense documents declassified in 2002 and 2003, the stated objectives of Project SHAD included testing detection equipment for chemical and biological agents, evaluating decontamination procedures, assessing how agents dispersed in maritime environments, training personnel to respond to chemical and biological attacks. The tests were conducted by the Deseret Test Center, a U.S. Army facility, in coordination with the U.S. Navy. Between 1962 and 1973, Project SHAD conducted tests in the Pacific Ocean, near Hawaii, off the coast of Alaska, and in other locations. The tests involved Navy ships, aircraft, and approximately 5,900 military personnel. Here's what the declassified documents reveal about what actually happened. Project SHAD tests were given code names: Fearless Johnny, Copperhead, Eager Bell, Flower Drum, Shady Grove, Night Train. Each operation had specific objectives documented in military planning records. According to Department of Defense fact sheets, the tests typically followed this pattern. A Navy ship would be positioned in a designated test area. Aircraft or naval vessels would spray the ship with chemical or biological agents, either from above or upwind. Sensors aboard the ship would measure contamination levels. Personnel responses would be evaluated. The tests used both simulants and active agents. Simulants included bacteria like Bacillus globigii, considered non-pathogenic, and chemical tracers like zinc cadmium sulfide and sodium fluorescein. These substances were intended to mimic the dispersal patterns of more dangerous agents without causing harm. But according to declassified documents, the tests also used actual chemical and biological warfare agents. Chemical agents included sarin and VX, both nerve agents. Sarin disrupts the nervous system, causing convulsions, respiratory failure, and potentially death. VX is even more lethal and persistent. Biological agents included Coxiella burnetii, the bacteria that causes Q fever, a disease that can lead to chronic fatigue, hepatitis, and endocarditis. The Department of Defense maintains that exposures were controlled and that safety protocols were followed. They state that agent concentrations were kept at levels considered safe. However, according to testimony from veterans during 2002 Senate hearings, many participants were not informed about the nature of the tests. Some sailors reported being told the substances were harmless. Others stated they received no information at all about what they were being exposed to. Let me give you specific examples from declassified records. Operation Fearless Johnny involved testing chemical agent detection and decontamination aboard naval vessels. According to DoD documents, this test used sarin nerve agent. Operation Copperhead tested biological agent dispersal. While specific agents used remain partially classified, declassified portions indicate live biological agents were employed. Operand Flower Drum, conducted in 1964, involved spraying the USS George Eastman with biological agents to test detection systems and crew response procedures. The tests weren't limited to open-air spraying. According to declassified documents, some experiments involved releasing agents in confined spaces, mess halls, berthing compartments, and ventilation systems, to assess contamination spread and detection capabilities in enclosed environments. Here's where the documentation becomes critically important. According to the Institute of Medicine's 2007 study commissioned by Congress, many Project SHAD participants have incomplete or missing service medical records. The study found that exposure data for individual participants was often not documented at the time of the tests. This created a significant problem decades later, when veterans began seeking disability benefits for health conditions they believed were connected to their participation in Project SHAD. For nearly 30 years, Project SHAD remained classified. That began to change in the late 1990s when investigative journalists started uncovering evidence of Cold War-era military experiments involving U.S. personnel. In 2000, CBS News reported on secret chemical and biological warfare tests conducted on American troops. The reporting prompted congressional inquiries. In 2002, under pressure from Congress and veterans advocates, the Department of Defense began declassifying Project SHAD documents. The Pentagon released fact sheets describing 50 specific tests. The documents identified ships involved, general timeframes, and categories of agents used. The Department of Defense also established a hotline for veterans who believed they had participated in the tests. However, significant information remained classified. Specific exposure levels for individual participants were not disclosed. Complete rosters of all personnel involved were not released. Details of some tests remained redacted. In May and June 2002, the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs held hearings on Project SHAD. Veterans testified about their experiences. Several described developing serious health conditions, cancers, respiratory diseases, neurological problems, that they believed were connected to their participation in the tests. They also testified about a common problem. When they applied for VA disability benefits, their claims were denied because their service medical records contained no documentation of their participation in Project SHAD or exposure to chemical or biological agents. The Department of Veterans Affairs responded by creating a Project SHAD registry, allowing veterans to register their participation and request medical evaluations. The VA also began reviewing previously denied disability claims from individuals who could demonstrate they were likely participants. But questions remained about the health impacts of the tests. In 2003, Congress directed the Institute of Medicine to conduct a comprehensive study examining the long-term health effects of Project SHAD participation. The IOM's 2007 report reached a conclusion that was, on its face, reassuring. The study found no clear evidence of adverse long-term health effects among Project SHAD participants compared to other veterans. However, the report heavily qualified this finding. The researchers noted that their analysis was severely limited by incomplete data. Individual exposure records were missing or never created. Medical records were incomplete. There was no consistent baseline health data collected before the tests. Control groups were poorly defined. The IOM stated explicitly, "The absence of evidence of adverse health effects should not be interpreted as evidence that adverse effects did not occur." In other words, they couldn't find evidence of harm, but that was because the evidence didn't exist, not because harm didn't occur. A follow-up National Academies study in 2016 reached similar conclusions. The data limitations made it impossible to definitively assess long-term health impacts. According to Department of Defense records, approximately 5,900 military personnel participated in Project SHAD tests. Most were young enlisted sailors. What happened to them? According to veteran advocacy organizations and congressional testimony, many Project SHAD participants later developed serious health conditions. These include various cancers, particularly lymphomas and leukemias, respiratory diseases, and neurological disorders. Establishing a causal connection between Project SHAD participation and these conditions has proven difficult, largely due to the documentation problems already discussed. When veterans applied for disability benefits, the VA required evidence that their conditions were service-connected. Without medical records documenting their exposure to chemical or biological agents, many claims were denied. After the 2002 declassification, the VA began accepting alternative evidence of participation, including ship assignments during test periods and testimony from fellow veterans. Some previously denied claims were approved on review. However, by the time Project SHAD became public knowledge, many participants had already died. According to veterans organizations, some died before they could file claims. Others died during the lengthy appeals process. The families of deceased veterans faced their own challenges. Without documentation proving the veteran participated in Project SHAD, survivor benefit claims were often denied. Here's what we know from official sources. The Department of Defense admits that records for some Project SHAD tests are incomplete or missing. They attribute this to various factors, including the classified nature of the program, the passage of time, and standard records retention policies that allowed destruction of certain documents after specified periods. What we don't know is the full extent of what occurred. Some test details remain classified. The identities of all participants haven't been fully confirmed. The complete list of chemical and biological agents used hasn't been disclosed. Project SHAD is significant not because it was unique, but because it was documented. The declassified records prove that the U.S. military conducted chemical and biological warfare experiments, using its own personnel as test subjects over more than a decade. These tests were authorized at the highest levels of the Pentagon. Thousands of sailors participated, many without informed consent according to their own testimony. When those sailors later developed health problems, incomplete documentation prevented many from receiving disability benefits they may have deserved. This raises several questions that remain unanswered. First, Project SHAD was one component of Project 112, which included land-based tests and other research efforts. How many other programs existed that haven't been declassified? The Department of Defense has acknowledged Project SHAD only because congressional pressure forced disclosure. What remains classified? Second, what happened to the research data from these tests? If the purpose was defensive, developing detection systems and countermeasures, what did the Pentagon learn? Were the results worth the human cost? These questions haven't been publicly answered. Third, what are the current policies regarding human subjects research in classified military programs? Project SHAD ended in 1973. Informed consent standards have changed significantly since then. But we only learned about Project SHAD 30 years after it ended. What's happening now under classification that we won't learn about until the 2050s? The pattern is clear from the historical record. Classified military programs involving human subjects are disclosed, if at all, only decades after the fact. Often only under congressional pressure, and typically with incomplete documentation. Project SHAD is documented fact. The tests happened. The agents were used. The sailors participated. Many weren't told what they were being exposed to. Their medical records are incomplete. And when they sought benefits, many were denied. This isn't speculation. This is based on Department of Defense declassified documents, Institute of Medicine studies, and congressional testimony. The Pentagon maintains that safety protocols were followed and that exposures were controlled at safe levels. Veterans tell a different story. The incomplete documentation makes it impossible to definitively determine the truth. What we can say with certainty is this. The U.S. military used its own personnel in chemical and biological warfare experiments. And the full truth about those experiments remains partially classified more than 50 years later. In the next episode, we'll look at another declassified program and ask what these patterns reveal about the relationship between national security, government secrecy, and the people who serve.